Chapter 5. Atlas wasn't sure he knew what to expect when he approached the door at the end of the alley for the second time in 2 days. It was just 2 minutes before 10 o'clock, exactly the time he had agreed to meet Kay again in the same place. His meeting with the man named Quint Ward had gone better than he could have possibly imagined. The man was on board completely. In fact, it had gone so well that Atlas had almost been late to return to the station to clock out at the end of his shift before leaving to come here. Ward's fiancée, Isabella Valdez, had been a little nervous about what she termed a secret society, but Atlas had been able to maintain his cover as a police officer for years, which was a job where his background was constantly checked and his performance regularly scrutinized. If he could keep his own identity a secret, then protecting Ward and his soon-to-be wife would probably be even easier. But what he'd heard from Ward about this FBI agent was something else entirely. It didn't sit well with him at all. Something wasn't right about it. The FBI was an investigative body. They were basically a glorified federal police force. They made arrests, looked into crimes, and took especially dangerous criminals off the streets. To get a job with them required an even more extensive application process than it took to get into a local or state police force. At the end of their meeting, Ward had decided not to call the agent named Holler, a choice that both Atlas and Ward's fiancée thought was a wise one. Atlas was glad all three of them were on the same page with that. If even one of them disagreed on something that major, it could jeopardize their partnership, and then Atlas would have one less potential member of his group, not to mention a liability to their secrecy. Ward had also expressed a very keen interest in being trained, or at least being among people with similar gifts and finding out the true extent of his power. His ability to absorb kinetic energy and use any blunt force blows to enhance his own senses and strength made him a potential powerhouse, and Atlas could only imagine what kind of power the man could wield if there was no known limit to how much energy he could absorb. From what he'd said, it appeared that he and Atlas were very much alike in their desire to use their abilities for other people's benefit, but Ward was much less trusting of society than Atlas was. Apparently, Isabella had tried to convince him, when she first found out about his power, to seek out and help discreetly, but Ward had decided that it was better if no one else knew about his abilities. Now that Atlas had basically barged into their lives with the power of his badge, however, Ward was much more open to getting guidance. Atlas foresaw, just from the way their conversation went, that Quint Ward would be an extremely valuable addition to the structure of the group that he and Mary Ann hoped to create. Now, though, Atlas had to mentally switch gears. He knew that this second meeting had been Kay's idea, but other than that, he wasn't totally sure what the purpose of it was, other than to answer more questions for the masked private security contractor. Atlas had also at least a dozen different questions for Kay, but he didn't want to push his boundaries for fear of spooking him. Kay seemed like the kind of man who could appear and disappear from the radar at will, and Atlas still had no clue what kind of powers Kay possessed, so he didn't know how dangerous a confrontation with Kay might be. He approached the door and knocked on it a few times before opening it. When he walked in, it was once again completely dark. For a moment, he thought he heard a chain clinking against the concrete floor in the darkness, but he couldn't be sure. "Kay?" Atlas called. "It's me." The lights flipped on again, just like before, except that this time an entirely new sight awaited the Heford City police officer. The entire back half of the room was packed with training equipment. Mats for grappling and sparring, punching bags, punching dummies, punching gloves, kicking shields, hand-to-hand practice weapons, bullseye targets. The place looked like an entire martial arts dojo had hauled their stuff into the building since last time Atlas had been there. Across the room, mounted on the far wall, was a large wooden board that took up the entire wall, various images of thuggish criminal types plastered all over it. Some of them were pictured holding guns, some with knives or bats or other various instruments of vandalism and assault. They were almost identical to the targets that the HCPD used for marksmanship training at the police station, except instead of seeing bullet holes in them, Atlas saw that Kay was apparently an expert with throwing blades. A few throwing knives were sticking out of the paper limbs or hands, and there was a throwing hatchet buried in one of the paper thug's foreheads. Kay was there too, standing over by the light switch, but instead of his blue overcoat he was wearing jeans, a black sleeveless t-shirt, and what appeared to be a modified bulletproof vest, which held at least a dozen or more throwing knives nestled along his ribs. On his back was a case for what appeared to be a collapsible sword of some kind. "Holy cow," Atlas murmured in amazement. "I decided to do some practice while I waited for you," Kay informed him. Atlas was almost so surprised with all of the material in the room that for a moment he failed to realize that this was the first time he'd seen Kay's face. He had short, close-cut brown hair, brown eyes, and a thin goatee on a long, even face, in which his nose and his deep brow were its most prominent features. He wasn't the giant, muscular juggernaut Atlas had imagined him to be. He appeared well-toned, but also a bit lean compared to what Atlas had expected from someone who carried himself like Kay did. It was after Atlas had been studying Kay's face for a few moments that he realized something even more stunning. "Wait, you were practicing throwing knives in the dark?" Kay simply nodded. His face, Atlas realized, was similar to the mask from the night before. It was mostly expressionless as he talked. "Do you have night vision?" Atlas asked. "Is that your gift?" "My gift is that I'm always on target," Kay replied. In one swift move, he pulled a knife from his side and flung it across the room so fast that Atlas barely saw it flying through the air. It hit one of the thug images dead center in the chest. Kay held his arm out for a split second, then turned toward Atlas. "Your turn, big guy," he said. "Show me what you're made of." Atlas laughed. "Interesting choice of words," he replied. He touched his hand to the concrete wall and breathed in. Whenever Atlas changed the substance of his body, he felt as though whatever he touched was breathed in by him, as if by touching it, he was vacuuming up a few of the molecules and allowing them to replace the fleshy body molecules that came together to make him. It felt good, especially when he changed into something that was much harder or tougher than his natural form. It was like putting on another set of clothes. On the other hand, if he shifted into a form made of something less solid, like liquid or any kind of fabric, it felt like he was shedding clothes and becoming more vulnerable. It was also harder to control something that was less solid than his original body. But concrete surfaces were plentiful, and it was something he had done many times before. It was a form that was entirely comfortable for him. He saw Kay's surprise in the raised brow and the unblinking stare. It was the second time that day he'd gotten that kind of reaction. Whenever he spoke while in concrete form, his voice came out like the sound of stones rubbing or knocking together. "Right now I'm made of concrete," he told Kay. Kay stood there for a moment, the corner of his mouth turned up slightly. "You know, earlier today I suspected that you were just lying to me about having a power," he said. "I'm impressed." The two approached one another, Kay eyeing Atlas's concrete visage the entire time. Atlas thought he saw something in Kay's eyes, some sort of flash or bright haze that seemed like light reflecting off his eyeballs. He walked up to Atlas and his hand hovered in front of Atlas's chest. "If you're looking for a weakness," Atlas told him, "you won't find one. Every spare inch of me is now made of solid concrete." Kay smirked, a gesture that Atlas chose to take as amusement rather than mockery. "Just about every substance on Earth has a weak point," he informed the bigger man. "Some are harder to spot than others, but that's my gift. I can see shatter points." Kay's finger touched a spot on Atlas's torso, just below where the heart would have been. "Right now, yours is right here. If I strike that just right with enough force, you'll crack and crumble like you were hit with a jackhammer." It was Atlas's turn to raise his eyebrows. "Now I'm impressed." Kay narrowed his eyes. "You're also a little intimidated," he said to Atlas. "I can sense emotions, too, so don't worry, because I didn't come here to break you down. If I wanted to take you out, it would have happened already." As Atlas transitioned back into flesh, Kay turned and walked back toward his pile of stuff. "You said you wanted to help other people like us," Kay continued, gesturing to all his equipment. "You said some of them would need training to learn to control their abilities. I can help, but I need to know one thing." "What's that?" Atlas asked. Kay turned and faced him from the center of the room, his arms crossed. Atlas thought he looked a lot like a military drill instructor when he did that. "Why train these people? What purpose would it serve?" Atlas considered the question and thought it best to answer honestly. "Truth be told, my biggest desire is to help people, learn how to use their abilities to best help others. Right, I remember you said that last night, Kay replied, one of his hands coming up to thoughtfully stroke the stubble on his chin. But what would you do with someone whose powers make them able to destroy things, or kill people? How would that help? Atlas wasn't sure he liked the direction this was going. What are you getting at, Kay? Are you training a relief mission or are you training an army? That was out of the question for Atlas. Nope, no armies. We're not going to be fighting anyone. What if we have to defend ourselves? What if regular people decide we don't deserve to coexist with them? This is not an us versus them situation, Kay, Atlas insisted. The world doesn't even know we exist. Kay's brow dropped into an icy stare. The world will find out, whether we want them to or not. What then? Atlas had to think about that. Ward's encounter with the FBI agent came to mind just then. What if the world already does know? He wondered. But he was able to answer both his question and Kay's question together. Then we'll deal with it when it comes, Atlas replied firmly. There's no use worrying about it now, not when we don't even know how society will respond. We're not going to make the situation any better by appearing as though we're training an army to conquer the world. And I certainly hope that isn't your goal, because if it is, we're going to have some issues. Kay laughed. Nah, couldn't care less about the world. And there are already more than enough armies led by reckless tyrants. But I've spent a lot of my life in the shadows. And I want to find more important things to do with my powers than just throw knives at targets in the shadows. I'm also very good at training other people, and I make one heck of a bodyguard. That's it, Atlas said, jumping at the chance to fully explain. I want to help each person find their own way to use their abilities to best help others and make their lives fulfilling. I believe that the best way to do that is to allow them to discover how to use their gifts to serve others. Everything happens for a reason, so my hope is that we can help others find that reason in their own lives. Kay looked at the floor, his gaze taking him someplace 1,000,000 miles away. He turned and paced a short distance across the room for a moment, then sat down on top of one of the punching bags that was lying sideways on the floor. He folded his hands in front of his chin, resting his elbows on his knees. You make it sound so simple, he murmured, deep in thought. Atlas shrugged. I try. Kay looked up at him, appearing to be thinking through some things even while he spoke. Some of these people, and their powers, they won't be able to control them or use them without serious physical training. Yes, Atlas said, wanting to hear more. Kay looked at all his equipment, then back at Atlas. Obviously, I'm suited for the job. I have no doubt of that. Do you currently have any students for me? Atlas shook his head. Not yet. I have my family, though. I was hoping we could train each other first, and then as we get more people to join us, we could bring them into the fold over time. Kay nodded. Sounds reasonable enough. You have a specific place in mind, or is this the best we have so far? Atlas shook his head. No, I have a place. A big place? Atlas nodded with a big grin. A big place. I challenge you to find enough equipment to fill it up. Kay seemed surprised to hear that. You make that much as a cop? What, is your wife a doctor or a government person? She was a high school English teacher, actually. I assume there's a story behind this big place then, Kay surmised. Atlas nodded again. Yep, but I'll have to let you see it first before I tell you. Fair enough, and then we can settle on payment. Atlas froze. Payment? Kay narrowed his eyes. A fella's got to make a living somehow. I'm not training specials for free. Kay, Atlas said, hoping he sounded more convincing than disappointed. This is so much bigger than money. Then I guess it won't be too much of a hardship for you to hand some of it over to me for the sake of the cause, will it? Atlas sighed a weary sigh, leaning against one of the concrete columns. Kay clearly wasn't going to back down on that, at least not tonight. Tell you what, we can work that out later. Kay rose from his punching bag seat with a convincing I win smile emerging as he offered his hand. Good talk, Mr. Atlas. Good talk, Kay, Atlas replied with a fatigued smile. So when do you want to come over and see the place I have in mind? Is it at your home? It is, but it's a little remote, he cautioned. Kay smirked. This is Heford. This place is the definition of remote. The fact that they call it a city is ridiculous. So tomorrow? Sure, what time? I'm off all day tomorrow, Atlas told him. You can come or I can pick you up as long as I know what time you plan on being there. Kay cocked his head. I know your name, he told Atlas. I can find your address. Searching this community's phone book is like looking through a church directory. Not that hard. See you at noon tomorrow, your place. All right. Noon tomorrow it is.